Ben Bradley, let me start with you because you asked a question about northern schools. But let me ask you about, I suppose, another issue which many MPs in the north are now getting exercised, which is about transport links in the north. Now, Boris Johnson was asked about Northern Rail and he was asked about HS2. We didn't really get any clarity from him, but presumably he does have to deliver on improved railway links or he is in big trouble.
I think he absolutely does, and we need to recognise in 5 years' time we need to see some tangible outcome from this rhetoric about investing in the Midlands and the North. Absolutely. That goes across transport, across skills, across so many other areas. Northern Rail seems to be in a real mess, and there seems to be ongoing discussion and a plan to change that, whether it's removing the franchise or forcing improvements. We've said we'll look at that franchising system and how we can make it work for people. I also think we're sometimes guilty of having this kind of middle class obsession with trains a little bit as well, and actually for many communities, mine in Mansfield for example, I think good bus links and that internal kind of town economy for people to get around locally is almost more important.
Where do you fall in the argument between having a brand new spanking line going to London and improving existing rail infrastructure in the north?
We've obviously got the review ongoing, various bits have been leaked. I'm kind of agnostic, I think there are benefits to both. HS2 would have a great benefit to my constituency. There's a hub nearby at Chesterfield where we can access jobs and that would be great. But equally, if we don't do that and we choose to invest in those regional transport infrastructure, in our roads, our rail, our bus services, I think there's a benefit to that too. So either way, I just think for God's sake, let's stop talking about it and get on and do it.
Okay, Rachel Maskell, where are you in this argument? Do you think actually the answer is better existing links or building HS2?
Well, first of all, the government has already said they're going to remove the franchise, and I've written to the Secretary of State to say what we need to ensure is that it's using the operator of last resort mechanisms to ensure, first of all, we stabilise the jobs of people working for Northern, but also that's about bringing it back into public ownership to ensure there is stability built, but also integration across the rest of the network. In the north, only 2% of people are using rail, and that says really we need to see the transition onto public transport, that modal shift vital for our environmental footprint as we move forward, and therefore the government really need to put the investment in rail right across the north. And of course, looking at enhancements as we move forward, we need to see that across the north, the Pennine route, the Trans-Pennine route, absolutely crucial, but also we have to build more capacity from the London and the southeast into the north and into Scotland, and therefore what we believe is that we need that proper infrastructure investment, of which I would say a change in direction on High Speed 2, but nonetheless putting that line in place.
Pete Wishart, do you think HS2 will ever get to Scotland?
No, it doesn't look like it, and we've seen obviously plans and ambitions, but nothing concrete and nothing substantial. I'm fascinated by all the talk about the north, because for us, of course, it's the near south, and this attention that seems to be given to the north because of the success in Conservative constituencies in the course of the past few weeks has dramatically changed the tone and nature of so much debate. I've never heard the near south, as we call it, getting so much attention from Conservatives. But at some point, I think people in the near south will realise that they've got Conservative MPs who do Conservative things, and they're not likely to act in the interests of people who traditionally vote in particular ways in the near south. And that's the day of reckoning I think is going to come pretty soon, is when this realisation works itself out. But it's fascinating listening to all this now.
Let me just ask you one thing which struck me during PMQs was that Boris Johnson seemed to go out of his way to front up to the SNP in pretty bruising, aggressive language. And clearly he's not in any mood to compromise with the SNP, certainly not over another independence referendum. Where does that leave the SNP?
Well, this is quite fascinating. We've seen this quite a bit in the course of the past few weeks. It's a new, very aggressive tone by the Prime Minister, and I think that the sole message is just to aggressively say no to Scotland. And I think there's a view in the Conservative Party, particularly for some of their advisers, to suggest that this is a way to take on the Nats. Don't give them an inch or they'll take a yard. I've got a little bit of caution and advice to my Conservative colleagues. It won't work, This consistent singing no is only building the case for Scottish independence, where I think we're going to see a couple of opinion polls in the next few weeks that's going to show and suggest that. I think it'd be better get round the table. We've got an issue here, we've got a mandate, they've got a mandate. How do we resolve it? How do we fix it out? Do we respect the people of Scotland, or do we take them on? And I think we have to debate that properly.
Jeremy Corbyn focused on universal credit. I wonder if there's a danger of Labour getting bogged down in an old argument, because 5 years on, universal credit will have been bedded in, it'll be up and running. Is there any point in locking yourself down and saying, we're going to get rid of it?
Well, we absolutely must bring about real change around universal credit, and it's shown it's a complete discredit in the way that we're seeing child poverty increase, the three-child or more policy, which is actually putting more and more children into poverty. By 2022, 5.2 million children in this country will be living in poverty, 43% in families of 3 children or more. It's not working, and therefore the very objectives, as Jeremy set out today, that it was there to do, remove poverty, to produce secure employment, it hasn't met those objectives, and therefore it's really important that the government admit their failure in its introduction and pushing people into poverty, and therefore to scrap the system and put something in which actually works for people across the country.
What's your impression of universal credit in your Mansfield constituency?
Well, certainly the local job centre have been really pleased with the way it's gone. They felt that they've had the flexibility to be able to adapt. And one thing that doesn't come across in this discussion all the time is that actually it's changed and updated and improved every fortnight as we go along. When those things are raised, it goes through government and it is literally improved and changed to deal with issues every 2 weeks. So it's a responsive system. I think moving anything on that scale is a real challenge. But when we get bedded into that and people are used to the system and the way it works, it will be better. And even Labour agreed in principle that it was a better system. The challenge that Labour want to put back on people is when we get to that point where it's bedded in and it's working, they want to rip it all out and transition everybody back again, which would be a nightmare.
Okay, let me just move to one other issue, which I particularly want to put to you, Rachel, which is this idea floated at the weekend of the House of Lords moving to your constituency, to York. Really? Is it going to happen?
Well, we want everyone to move to York. We're a fantastic city, and of course the ancient Parliament did sit in York, so there is a right for Parliament to return there. But I believe that Boris Johnson could be putting something serious about trying to show some indicators that he is trying to lean into the north to say, I'm listening, but actually it's not about House of Lords that moving this institution there. We want to see real House of Lords reform. Of course, we want to see an elected chamber, but also what we need to ensure is that we invest in jobs in the city. Now, the House of Lords would provide great opportunity for York to have those high quality jobs, but we need to see therefore more of government moving out across the country, and the key thing is that there's so much power invested in this place, in Westminster, and we need to push that out into the regions, and that's very much where Labour is coming from.
Okay, Ben Bradley, we know that the government has been talking a lot about reform of Whitehall, shaking up the way government works. In your bones, do you think the House of Lords is going anywhere anytime soon?
I'd certainly like to see reform, whether it moves out of here. Is that the most important thing? I'm glad it's being discussed. I do think there is a real place for it, because actually they do have a role in that detailed scrutiny and making sure that we are held to account in terms of the detail of what's in our legislation. I'd like to see fewer of them, and I'd like to perhaps see a term limit or something like that in there. Hopefully that will be discussed. I think there's more of an appetite in the country than there's ever been for that constitutional reform and making sure that this place really works for people.
Peter Wishart, I saw Gordon Brown was suggesting the House of Lords ought to be turned into some sort of forum for the nations and regions. Good idea?
Well, this always happens when the Labour Party are in trouble in Scotland. Federalism becomes some sort of issue and prospect. They don't even know what federalism means in a multi-union democracy like we have here, a multi-nation union that we have in the United Kingdom. All the plans are totally threadbare, and we've got no idea of what they're suggesting. The only thing we should be doing with the House of Lords is scrapping it. It is a bloated institution full of failed politicians, donors and cronies. And Labour should, and I have to say this with due respect to Rachel, stop taking places in this institution. All you're doing is feeding this undemocratic forum. There's only one thing that should happen, and that's get the ermine off and get rid of that place totally.
Well, what about that, Rachel Maskell? Why keep appointing people to an unelected chamber?
Well, eventually the House of Lords is going to have to vote for reform and pass that legislation. If you haven't got people in the chamber, it's never going to happen. And if we see at the moment crucial amendments being returned to the House of Commons today about child refugees, that wouldn't have happened had we not got a second chamber. So it's got a role, and at the time, while it's still in place, we will utilise that role, but of course we want to see an elected chamber in the future.
We've heard a lot of talk about Jeremy Corbyn possibly nominating John Bercow for a peerage. What's your take on that idea?
Well, I think John Bercow should sit in the House of Lords. There is tradition in that, but also I think he's got a lot to offer, having examined the way that this place works and to bring that to the fore. And while we've got an appointed chamber, absolutely he should be there. But of course, when we come up for elections, it will be his choice whether or not to stand.
Would you be happy to see John Bercow in the Lords?
I wouldn't be particularly thrilled. I think it's Jeremy Corbyn making it harder for whoever follows him, I think, with moves like that. There's obviously a lot hanging over John Bercow from this place in terms of internal investigations allegations and rumours about his conduct. So I think that's difficult, and it says a lot, I think, that he's gone for Bercow ahead of people like perhaps Caroline Flint or Kate Hoey, big figures in the Labour Party that would have a lot to offer the Lords, I think.